So welcome to Chat Bites. I'm Jennifer Philla, CEO of the Prospect Research Institute, your host today, and I am thrilled to introduce our guest, prospect research professional Anne Soule. Hailing from Ohio, she has been researching since before the Internet became popular. That's all I'm going to say about that, Anne. Thank you for joining us today, Anne.
Well, thanks for having me, Jen. It's really great to be here.
I wanted to share with everyone how you and I are together today talking. And it all started when you attended one of my VIP classroom tours. And at that time, I was having small groups peeking in at the newly developed Insider Stock and Compensation Classroom. And of course, you were there. And during the tour, when people were asking questions and making comments, you shared one of your fabulous inside stories about when you saved the day because of your ability to research insiders. And I'm hoping that you'll share one of those stories with us today.
Well, I'd love to share that story. It's actually one of my favorite research stories. This was a number of years ago. I was researching a prospect for the president of a large research university. He had a meeting planned in another state with a prospect he'd been cultivating for a while. This prospect had founded a company, and it was about to go public. And he had told the president that as soon as the IPO was completed, he was going to give a seven-figure gift to establish the professorship. So the president was going to go and meet with him about a week after the IPO was to have been completed, and they were going to hopefully close the gift. So I'm researching this prospect, and I'm looking into the company, and I discover that the IPO is a little bit different. They were launching with what's called a Dutch auction IPO, and that was new to me. I'd never heard of that before. So apparently I wasn't paying attention when Google went public because that's how they did it too. But basically with a normal IPO, they pick the date of the IPO, and as of that date, the shares go on sale at a preset price. You know, all the shares are available for $50 per share or $200 per share or whatever the price that they've decided upon is. With a Dutch auction IPO, there's a 2-week bidding period that leads up to the date of the IPO in which potential investors can bid on the shares. And the purpose of doing it that way is to get a feel for what share price the market will bear to help them settle on the eventual launch price when the IPO happens. So in this case, they were hoping for $40 per share. And they were kind of guessing that it was going to come in somewhere around $20 per share and $40 per share. So at $40 per share, my prospect's holdings were going to instantly have a value of $400 million. And if it had been $20 per share, his shares were going to be worth $200 million. So I thought that was just so neat. I had never heard of this before, and just out of sheer curiosity, I kept going back to check on the bidding price to see where it was going to end up. It never dawned on me. What eventually happened was a big surprise. A couple days before the president was supposed to, or actually the day before, the president was going to get on the plane and go visit this guy, I checked in one last time and discovered that because the market would not support anything close to 40 or even 20, in fact, all indications were that the best launch price was going to be $10 per share, and that was lower than they were willing to go. So rather than go through with the IPO at $10 per share, they just decided to cancel it altogether. So the IPO was completely canceled. It never happened. So I actually, in this occasion, I walked over to the president's office. I thought it was really important for him to know this before he got on that plane. And I let him know that the IPO had been canceled, so they were likely going to have a very different conversation when he got there to talk with the prospect. And, you know, in that instance, he was so grateful. We had a president at that time that wanted to know everything. In fact, he was just so grateful that he had been prepped in this manner for the visit that he just lauded the whole research department with kudos for our great work. So for us, that was a really, it was too bad about the IPO, but for us, it really kind of registered the research department on the president's radar in a new way, and it was good.
That's amazing. Yeah, sheer curiosity, and you ended up saving face for him. You made him look really good.
Yeah, it's funny because I didn't have any thought really of doing that. It was just out of curiosity, like you said, but then it ended up working out really well.
So you became the superhero. That's pretty wonderful. Well, and not only that, but it really respects the donor, right? Because you were helping the president create a very good relationship with that person who is still likely to, or a good prospect for making multi-millions at some point, just not today.
Exactly. And I think the prospect was probably, I don't know what the word is, maybe not grateful, but pleased that the president came to the meeting already knowing. You know, it would have been maybe a little bit awkward if he hadn't known.
Yeah, it was probably flattering and a bit relieved that he didn't have to explain it all.
Yeah.
I would have been.
Yeah, that's very human, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that story. That was a good story. I like it when the researcher is a superhero, because we all are. And as you know, I did ask the Prospecto listserv if anyone had questions about insider stock holdings, and quite a few people responded. So a couple of them indicated confusion around derivative securities, stuff like deferred stock units, restricted stock units, and phantom stock units. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, what are those strange phantom things, and when is it important to include them in a profile?
Well, first I'd like to say that I think these are one of the most complex things that a prospect researcher has to master. They are confusing. I mean, I've been researching for, since before the internet was popular. And sometimes these things are confusing. You have to understand them. You've got to read the footnotes. There's just no way around that. In my experience, variations from company to company, so you really have to read those footnotes. And sometimes the definitions are so obtuse that it's even hard to untangle. But that's where they're explained. Often they function like options, but not always. I think that how to include them in the profile requires us to put on our analysis hat, really, and kind of weigh how much time is required to understand this versus the value of having the information. For example, if someone only owns, if you take their restricted stock units and it's not very many and it doesn't really tell us a whole lot about their wealth, then maybe at the qualification level it's not really worth your time to untangle all that if it's not going to really tell us more than we already know about their wealth. On the other hand, if they have huge amounts of these and it seems to be significant, then it is worth it. So it's sort of a case-by-case thing, I guess, for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. We never want to hear it depends or you have to look and see. But if you could explain just a little bit about why they use all those derivative securities. What's the most common usage? Like, why do we see them in the proxy and on the Form 4s?
Well, as to why, I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I think sometimes it's a way to give top executives more voting power. There might be restricted units that they can vote, but they may not sell, for example. Sometimes they function like incentive options. Right. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, I have seen them used a lot as compensation to keep them focused on the long term.
Yeah.
And then you're right. I've had the same dilemma. Like, okay, it's 20 years from now or some ridiculous time in the future. If I value them now, it's in essence meaningless because anything could happen in that amount of time to change the value.
Yeah.
It's a little crazy.
Yeah.
So one of the things you and I had talked about before, and someone actually asked about, I was glad to see, they want to know if you've ever been researching and found it was worth your time to go back into a prospect's insider trading history, or should we just look at recent stock holdings?
That's an interesting question because when I first was researching, I never traced the history, and I think it may have been partly due to the availability of the information. It's so easy to find now; it's much quicker. But it's sort of like at some point in my career, this light bulb went off, and I thought, it's worth looking at. And it especially was true. I was researching a prospect. I always look at a few years of proxy statements. I never look at just one. And I was noticing that this guy, year after year, he reported the same stock holdings. I think it was, I don't remember, but let's just say it was $250,000. It was not a very big amount of money. I went to his Form 4s and realized that in between the annual proxy statements, he was exercising options and selling shares like crazy. I totaled up all his share sales and calculated a gross profit of $12 million, which obviously just completely changes my understanding of his wealth. You know, $250,000 worth of stock versus $12 million, I would have never known because he did all the trades in between the annual proxy statement. So, you know, what he was reporting on the proxy is what he owned at that time. It was just leaving out all the buying and selling in between. So that was a huge, huge eye-opener for me about the value of looking back in time sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great example. That's quite a bit of difference. I'm not sure when I do qualification research, I think you might have me now peeking backwards at least a couple of times just to make sure that I'm not missing that.
It's true, and you can just sort of glance. If there's like 1,000 Form 4s filed, that tells you something's going on. If there's just a handful, well, he's not very active. So you can even just glance at the number of Form 4s to see if there's more that you need to research.
Well, and Yahoo Finance and MarketWatch show the insider history for a specific insider. So sometimes you can see a lot of that activity happening. It's just confusing because they're often trading shares to buy shares to exercise options, not always selling them.
It's true, and I find the language on the Form 4 does not always make it clear. There's some that are pretty obtuse, and it's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on there without spending hours.
Well, that pulls us right into another question somebody asked, which is, can you tell us about a time when you needed to use the Form 4, which is the form for reporting beneficial change in ownership, in addition to the definitive proxy, the Form DEF 14A, to find shareholdings? I don't know if that's the story you just told or not.
No, actually, I have a great story for that, too. This was another surprise. Being curious always helps. I was researching an executive with a huge corporation, and he wasn't one of the 5 most highly compensated, so he didn't have to report his shareholdings. But this was right after Sarbanes-Oxley had passed, and I just happened to meet this prospect when he was on campus. That sense of his personality, and he was just one of those people that just goes beyond the call of duty to make sure everything, all I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So for some reason, even though he wasn't technically required to, he chose apparently to voluntarily report all his holdings on Form 4. So even if you look at the proxy statement, he's not in there. But when I searched for his name under insider traders and pulled up all his Form 4s, I found all his stock and all his options. It was amazing. I'm not sure how often that's going to happen in real life. But it's sort of, a quick check never hurts because you never know what you're going to find.
Especially now that we can do a keyword search on a name.
Exactly.
There's just no excuse not to do it.
When I work so often, the little bios in the proxy include where people went to school. I'm not working for an Institute of Higher Education now, but one trick I used to use for proactive prospect identification was just to go to Edgar and search on the name of the school, and it'll pull up insiders. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Why not? Well, it leads us into our next question, too, in terms of, just trying to find them by name, doing some proactive work. Someone asked, how do the aggregators like Donor Search and iWave Pro come up with their numbers? The totals for one person often vary, sometimes by quite a lot. What should we be looking for when evaluating which to use, or should we be ignoring this easy route and figure out the holdings and sales using SEC sources?
Yeah, for me, my approach is this. I take the data in an aggregator, and I just use that as a starting point. That's my cue that I need to go directly to the SEC data and make sure that every detail is accurate. As for how they get it, I'm not familiar with Donor Search. I use Wealth Engine a lot. I know how I have determined how they get it. They seem to be using the most recent data available. When I compare what Wealth Engine reports with the most recent proxy and the most recent Form 4, they are up to the minute accurate. But I still always go to the SEC and make sure that, for example, they're not accidentally including indirectly held shares or, with the timing of aggregators, there's always a lag between when they collect it and report it, and then other things can happen. So I always, always, always go to the SEC and just double-check everything there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. when I see it in the aggregator, I'm like, aha, I have an insider right to the SEC website.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never really looked at how they come up with their information.
I would say if I'm in a super hurry, sometimes your boss wants it right away and you just don't have time. If I'm in a super hurry, I will just double check that it's the right name and that really that prospect is affiliated with that company and go with the aggregator data. But that's only when you're in a real hurry.
I got a few questions about what forms should we look at in our research. And I wanted to share with everyone that on the website at www.prospectresearchinstitute.org, under the links/resources section is the Prospect Research Takes Wall Street collection. And in that collection are the links to the SEC list of forms with descriptions. And it also has another link for a more specific description of Forms 3, 4, and 5. That's the ownership changes forms. So people weren't sure where those were. They had seen them on the SEC website before, couldn't remember. So that is available to you in that collection of resources. And I also wanted to share that if you really want a fundraising researcher's guide to the SEC forms, you need to get your hands on the Insider Stock and Compensation Workbook on the Prospect Research Institute website. It's for sale, and it includes this wonderful chart. The volunteer group panel helped me put this together, where it has the form, what it is, and how it applies to fundraising, when you should be using it and what you should find in each form. So that is out there. That was a lot of people were interested. What are all these forms? They have these crazy names, and we're not sure.
I have a feeling that website's going to get a lot of hits in the future.
I hope so.
We need that.
Right. We all love collections, right?
Yeah.
So I had a few heads together. I thought, let's do it. It's part of what we're about at the Institute.
Fantastic.
And I have some other, we have like 5 minutes left, and I have a couple other questions. Do you want to take one more, Ann?
Sure.
Okay. So one of them was, what do you think is the easiest and most straightforward way to find and present stock holdings, especially for early qualification research?
Well, I think the easiest is probably what you mentioned, those places like Market Watch, where you can just type in a name and it pops right up. There's another one, too, that I love called j3sg.com. It's the same thing.
Yes.
So that's a great, quick way to run their name through aggregator, like you mentioned, like Donor Search or Wealth Engine or one of the other ones, just to see if it turns up any stock at all. That's probably the quickest way to find out if there are any.
You're right, J3SG, right? They do a wonderful job of getting all those really old stock holdings, too. Like they held it back in 1997, which the aggregators tend only to look at what's current. I almost forgot about that site. I'm glad you mentioned it, Ann. And then someone else had confusion about the Form 4. And I know that's difficult to do talking as opposed to, a webinar where someone could see visually, you could demonstrate. But they were confused about all those numbers and had trouble figuring out if the person even made money on the transaction. So they're wondering how could they learn to read the form, or do you have any tips for reading the Form 4?
Well, it's true that some of them are very confusing. Some of them are very clear. What I'm trying to do when I read one of them is trying to figure out first if it's a purchase or a sale, A or D, acquisition or a divest, and whether it's an option or a share. Trying to figure out whether they're exercising an option, which means they're actually buying stock, or trying to figure out what the basic transaction is and then work from there down. Sometimes they're just really hard. There have been questions I have, to be honest with you, that I can't figure out. Sometimes I have trouble. This is very, very confusing stuff. So I think if you work at it and read all the footnotes and dig deep into the Edgar website to find out what all those terms mean, you can untangle it. It will just take a while sometime.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. In one of the videos for the course, I used an example, and it was a very complicated executive compensation package, and I was unable to reconcile between the Form 4, the most current information, and the proxy, because the holdings had changed, and that's why they filed the Form 4. but the proxy had information that the Form 4 didn't. And I think sometimes it's okay not to have all the information or not to have every number match, because what we're presenting is an estimate anyway. It's going to change in 5 minutes.
That's a great point. It's a great point. The thing that I guess the question that drives me is, how will this help us understand his wealth, and how will this help us raise money? You know, if you're going to spend 5 hours or something that adds just such a minimal amount of understanding, it's probably not worth it. And I love what you just said, Jen. Sometimes it's okay to just say, I just don't know. Sometimes that's what the right answer is.
Right, it's that law of diminishing returns. Do I need to figure this out? Is it going to make a difference? Are we going to raise more money, or can I let it go?
I love the way you put that, the law of diminishing returns. That's exactly it.
It's one of my favorite concepts ever. But try to explain that to a supervisor, right? That gets difficult. Well, it looks like our time has ended. Anne, I wanted to thank you very much for sharing your stories and your expertise with us today. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks to everybody for calling in. This was fun.
Yes. That's it for us for now. Thank you for the great questions and for joining us on the second edition of Chat Bites. Have a great day, everybody.